The experience of exile is an experience of loss and of displacement and pain that shapes the life of those who seek refuge and of those who are left behind, often for generations. Despite all of Chaves Nogales' peerless work as a journalist in exile, these are the words that he wrote to his wife. And he wrote them in Spanish, and I took the liberty of translating them into English myself. I have a conviction that before the end of this year, and he's talking about around, even though it's not dated, around 1940, I will have consolidated my situation and I will have rebuilt my life. I do not know how to live other than how I have always lived. I miss the essentials. And you cannot imagine the effort that I have to do to not sink into the situation in which I find myself, alone and without any encouragement other than the hope of returning at some point to the ones I love, and the only life that seems tolerable to me. So going back to Spain for a minute, we'll come here with Spain in it. Manuel Chaves Nogales was born in Seville in 1897. And from a very early age, he started contributing to and later directing a number of publications in Seville, in Cordoba, and later in Madrid, including, this is just going to be a list of publications, Spanish publications, but well-known ones of the period: El Liberal, El Noticiero Sevillano, El Heraldo de Madrid, and La Estampa, notably Ahora, which I will go back to in a little bit. So always chasing the news, he traveled around Europe, and his writings are permeated by an international cosmopolitan outlook from the very beginning. He wrote Mediation on contemporary politics in Spain and the Soviet Union, and most famously about bullfighting. This is one of his books. So La Ciudad is published in 1921 as a very early work that collects his essays on the city of Seville. Then he writes La Vuelta a Europa en Avión, so Pequeño Burgués en la Rusia Roja, like a small bourgeois in Red Russia. The next one is what was left of the Tsar Empire, which was published, published in the 30s. The next one is also, once again, about his visits to the Soviet Union. So this one is called El Maestro Juan Martínez que estaba allí. And most famously, he wrote, his most famous book is El Maestro Juan The Bullfighter, Juan Belmonte Matador de Toros. So all these varied themes were approached with a journalistic style that, it is often said, predates the so-called New Journalism by around 3 decades. So he wrote chronicles and reportage that would have novelistic elements to it as well. And many of his serialized chronicles were later published in book form. So most of these were first published in different periodicals and then were collected. And this is what happened with Juan Belmonte Matador de Toros. So it was a series first in Estampa, and then Estampa itself, which is the magazine, published the book. So when the war in Spain broke out, Chaves Nogales in Madrid stayed in Madrid, continued his work as the director of a very well-known paper called Ahora, the journal called Ahora. And at this time, in 1936, it became an organ of the Republican government. A self-defined liberal and anti-fascist, he nevertheless felt estranged by the more far-left factions of the Republican side, but he kept working for the Republic nonetheless in Madrid. But when the Spanish government relocated to Valencia in November of 1936, he left with them, going into exile in Paris soon after, where he continued to work to support the Republican fight against fascism by writing articles about the situation in Spain and Europe. Particularly, he wrote a lot of articles that started being published in Latin America, and he started working for, and this is going to be, this is relevant because it's going to happen again in the UK, in London. He's going to become a writer and a director for the Corporation Press Service, an agency that will gather articles from other journalists about the situation in Spain and Europe to be sent to Latin America. So he leaves, he's in Paris in 1936, from 1936 to 1940, and in 1940 the Germans come to Paris, and he decides to come with another group of, small group of intellectuals to try to come to the UK, which he manages to do, and he tells his family to stay put and eventually go back to Spain, which they did. So this is when they were right there. So this is where he comes. He comes to London. He comes to Bloomsbury, so this is the first site of exile, and he comes to Russell Court, which is still a very big building. on not far from here, on Portland Place. And he settles there, and he does with other Spanish exiles who were already living there. His friend, the journalist Antonio Soto, and more famously Luis Portillo, who was with his wife, part of life were living above him. And as we read his obituary, and you can read it there. And I have in my note, read screen, and I was supposed to copy this here, but now I see the screen is very far away from me, so you're going to have to read it, because I cannot read it. It's quite a nice reflection on his persona and how his home was a place where all the Republicans from different factions would come and gather. So Bloomsbury is important for us today because of him and exiles, but also because it was the home of a lot of publishing houses, and still is. And some of these were very actively engaged in publishing, and they would continue to do so after the Spanish Civil War books about Spain. So we get, for instance, I've also marked administrative information, and I'll come back later to that when we talk about the BBC, but that's also an important reference point in Bloomsbury. So we have, for instance, that Juan Belmonte was published in English. This is now Juan Belmonte, Killer of Bulls, in 1937. So this is before, while he's still in France, it is before he comes to the UK, but it's published in English. And the next one, I went too far. The next book that was published was in the Distance Light, and it says it's the amazing book on the Spanish War, featured so sensationally in the Evening Standard under the title Heroes and Beasts. And that's what we're going to read, that's what Rahul is going to read a fragment of today. So that was first published, as you can see then, as a series of articles, or not articles, but short stories about the Spanish Civil War, and then they were gathered in a book, also published back in 1938, which was only a year after the Spanish original was published in Chile. We have other writers contributing as well. So, for instance, both Arturo Barea and Luis Portillo contributed to Horizon, which was Sir Connolly's literary magazine. And, for example, Barea wrote some reviews of Hemingway or Lorca, which are fairly well known. And Portillo wrote a very well known now account of the confrontation between Jan Estrada and Unamuno, which has been on the news recently. We also get T.S. Eliot and Faber and Faber, so he also, that's a trilogy, Arturo Barea's trilogy, but he also wrote, he also published books by other Spanish Republican exiles, for instance, that I was sending published Counterattack with him in 1937. And finally, we get the proliferation of the wartime pamphlets, and that gave some exiles the opportunity to publish longer political essays. So Chaves Nogales was due to publish his chronicle, which he had written while in France and on his way out in the UK, The Fall of France, which is called La Agonía de Francia. And he was due to publish this in the left-wing publisher and former editor of George Orwell, Victor Golan's Victory book series. And we see this because it was advertised. So in book number 5, you see that book number 4 is going to be Chaves Nogales, The Fall of France. It happened that the books did not come out necessarily in the order, so all the other books had been published before his. And eventually it was never published, which is kind of a pity, so we don't have the English version of it. But still, the Spanish version of this book, La Agonía de Francia, which was published in 1941, has, if you see, the subtitle version of versión original in English, de la española, of the English, The Fall of France, etc. So, second place for us to visit today is Fleet Street, which you all know. This is a very important place for Spanish Republican exiles because they're all going to engage in writing articles for famous or important widespread newspapers in the UK. So Chaves Nogales particularly, he writes for the Evening Standard. He has a regular column there. He's already been writing, or his articles have already been published in English prior to his coming to England. So this is a very famous series that he has, Defense of Madrid, about the Spanish Civil War. And as you can see, this was translated by Luis de Vallecano. And this, you have to bear in mind that all of this he's doing without speaking a word of English, which is not only his case, but the case of a lot of other Spanish Republican exiles. Arturo Barea also doesn't speak English. So they rely, and this is important, on the very important role of translators, friends or family sometimes, to do the work for them. So there's a very interesting relationship between original and not original work, and what gets published in different languages, etc. But a lot of the work gets published first in English, and then the originals get not translated, but published in Spanish. Anyhow, another of the important reasons why Fleet Street features prominently in Chaves Nogales' life in London is because during the war, he becomes the director of the Atlantic Pacific press agency, and there he does what he was been doing in France, which was to collate and write and get articles from other Spanish Republicans and other European intellectuals, actually, not just Spanish Republicans, to be sent to Latin America, particularly to inform about the war and the situation in Europe. And this was done, as most press agencies at the time, under the umbrella of the Ministry of Information and the Foreign Office as well. They were trying to control as much as possible what kind of information was going out. So we worked for that, and this is him in the agency, and this is a letter from the agency from Chaves Nogales. The place was 69 Fifth Street, that's the address, and he's writing to Arturo Barea. This is from the archive of Arturo Barea, and they're trying to arrange for Arturo Barea to participate somehow by writing some articles that could be sent to Latin America, but there's a slight problem here because Arturo Barea wants to be able to reuse some of the broadcasts that he's been writing for his BBC program. And Chaves Nogales says that he can't really do that because they only send over original and topical articles, but also they have to be signed by the author. And most of the articles at this stage is important for Barea that weren't signed by him, so his BBC broadcasts that were sent to Latin America were signed with Juan de Castilla. So you have the situation that the broadcasters did not broadcast with their actual names, but sort of so for some of them it was difficult to decide to do the jump to participate in the agency. Nonetheless, the list of people the list of exile writers that I said before, so Luis Portillo, Salvador Marriaga, the poet Luis Tenuda, all of them work for Chaves Nogales at one point or another, writing for this press. We're going to the BBC, as I've mentioned, so we have Broadcasting House here. So one of the most important contributions of the Spanish exiles to the war effort is their collaboration with the BBC Spanish, but mostly the Latin American service. Broadcasting first from Broadcasting House, which is there, after it was bombed by the Blitz, or in the Blitz, and this is from 1940, they have to move to Norton. You can see that most of the officers were destroyed. And Evesham for part of the war, and then they relocated to Bush House, which has been the house of the BBC World Service into 2012. So the first language to be inaugurated was the Arabic language service in January 1938, followed a few months later by the Spanish and Portuguese service to Latin America. So the former service was a response to Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia, and while the latter, the Spanish and Latin American, Spanish and Portuguese service to Latin America, was a strategy to counter Nazi propaganda. So on March 14, 1938, during a inaugural gala, Sir John Reed, the general director of the BBC, and the Colombian journalist Jorge Camacho, and I'll get to my page 8 here. There you go. And the Brazilian journalist Manuel Chaves gave the first broadcast to Latin America. And it works.
Estación de Londres de la BBC. Aquí Londres, estación da BBC.
From London and the BBC, greetings to all listeners in Central and South America. We're going to speak to you every evening in future in your own languages. We shall give you the news of the day as it reaches us from all over the world. They will be accurate and reliable.
De Londres y de la British Broadcasting Corporation, saludamos a todos los oyentes en América Latina.
Okay, So, due to diplomatic pressures, the BBC Spanish service had difficulties in hiring Spanish Republican exiles, you can imagine, during the war. But the BBC could not lose its credibility in the anti-fascist struggle, so many of them became part of the Latin American service. Such was the case of Chaves Nogales, and he had a regular broadcast called Esta Tarde en Londres. Arturo Barea and his weekly commentaries. Luis Portillo, who directed the daily program Radio Gaceta, and his wife, Cora Blythe, also worked for the London Transcription Service, which sent the physical recordings to Latin America. Not her, the service. Luis Bermuda, the poet, also worked for the BBC, and he translated and also wrote some original scripts for them. Salvador de Madariaga. So this is a famous picture of Arturo Barea, and here we have Salvador de Madariaga, the diplomat and writer, was a very frequent collaborator at the BBC Latin American service. And the quote that you have there is from 39, that it sort of applies to the balancing act that the BBC had to do with the contributors. So he's asking, this is Jorge Camacho, who we heard a minute ago. He's asking Madariaga to please not be so political. So he's asking him to perhaps, engage in some of the more neutral stories about Britain, not to be so overtly political. And this was quite difficult, considering that for the broadcasters, considering that the Latin American service, as well as all the languages services, which by 1943 they were broadcasting over about 50 languages or so. It was born out of the need to counter propaganda. So, but the BBC was always quite had a difficult relationship to it. Projecting Britain, British values and institutions became one of the core objectives behind all the language services. So aside from news and programs about the everyday life of the British people, were often mediated by these exiled broadcasters who translated between languages and cultures, and acting as intermediators between the corporation and the audiences, between Britain and the world. And at one point, Canadian journalist Stanley Max wrote in 1943 that the BBC canteen was, and I quote, is a sort of all nations hall of fame with sandwiches and coffee thrown in. The last place that we're going to look at is Cecil Court, and a little bit at the end Bruce Street there. So Cecil Court is the bookshop street. That's what it looks like today. So it became another place for cosmopolitan encounters, as not only it was a well-known meeting point for Jewish refugees in Britain, but Republican exiles such as Spanish artist Gregorio Prieto or Catalan poet Carles Riba, aside from all the others that I've been listing throughout this talk, they would meet with writers like Cecil Day-Lewis, Stephen Spender, or the journalist Kingsley Martin, and etc. And they would do so in John Jim's bookshop called Golden Books. This is what the street would have looked like. This is a picture actually from 1940. And this is, I couldn't get a picture of number 5, which is where the bookshop was. This is number 6. So there's a stamp store right next to it, so you can imagine that. Golden Books was founded by the bookseller, publisher, and translator Joan Gili at number 5 Cecil Court, and selling Spanish and Catalan books. And as you can see, they have a new address, and eventually they transferred to Oxford due to sort of the kind of material they had was quite dangerous for them to remain in London for other reasons. But and it still exists, actually. The imprint exists in Oxford. So according to his obituary in The Independent, and I'm quoting now, I can read that one. Number 5 Cecil Court became such a center for supporters of the Spanish Republic that in 1938, John Gili received threats from an official from the rival nationalist insurgent Spanish embassy in London that his family in Barcelona would suffer if he did not rein in these activities. And today, number 5 is home to the Italian bookshop, so if you're ever looking down, Cecil Court, you can read this. So it's also important, the Dolphin imprint is very important because they were also, so the bookshop is important because that's where the exiles gathered and met, and you would find Spanish books and books coming from Latin America for all the exiles, so it was a very important place for them. But it was also, the imprint is quite important because he published some books for the first time. So this is Luis Bermuda's Oknos, published in 1942, that's the first edition. And the most sort of successful book they published at that time was a translation of García Lorca's poetry, and this was done, the translation was done by Stephen Spender and G. So they jointly translated it. And it was introduced by Rahul Bery, who'd been a friend of Lorca's, and he also worked at the BBC, and he's part of the supposed of Exiles. I think the edition of Lorca's poem serves as an example of the international nature of the life and work of many Spanish exiles in London, whether in the reunions in Chaves Nogales' flat in Russell Court, or the literary and intellectual worlds of Bloomsbury and Cecil Court, or the wartime chronicling in Fleet Street and the BBC. So, however, exiles, emigres, and refugees and expats are often uprooted from their lands, and they must make do in new surroundings. And it's almost impossible very often to completely break the connection to the past, particularly through the smells and the flavors of what was once home. So for all the importance of the London of cosmopolitan encounters that we've been talking about, one of the Spanish Republican exiles' most emblematic meeting points was the Spanish anarchist-run restaurant the Mallorca, which was on 66 Brewer Street, and that's where some people, so the exiles would gather there. Arturo Barea famously met there with other Spaniards, and I know some of the exiles who later came, younger waves of exiles like Vicente Soto worked at the Mallorca. First I think in the kitchen and then as his secretary, and this is a very important place for Spanish Republican exiles. So I'm going to finish quickly, and I'm quoting Adorno's words in Minima Moralia, so Theodore Adorno's words, and he says, "For a man who no longer has a homeland, writing becomes home." And the spaces where this writing, I add, that was a quote, and I add, and the spaces where this writing and living and meeting and eating took place became the new home of a lot of Spanish Republican exiles, many of whom never returned to Spain, like Chaves Nogales, who died suddenly in 1944 and is buried here in London. So I do think that for many of them, London and Britain, and not only for them, but for their families, for the subsequent generations, became home. And it is important to chronicle this belonging, particularly in times like these. Thank you.
I'm one of the 10 grandsons of Chaves Nogales, and we have another one here tonight as well, full. So, and some of my family and great-granddaughter as well. So, I just want to say a few words really to give a bit of perspective from a family perspective before Rahul's going to go and have a look. So, first of all, I apologise that we arrived late. So, as they would say in Spanish, la puntualidad y falla. Our punctuality is flawed from that. I think one of the important things to say a little bit about Chaves Nogales is, and first of all, let me say, as one of 10 grandchildren, we didn't know our grandfather. Our grandfather, as you heard, died in 1944. So a lot of what we know and what we talk about is secondhand. It's from my mother, who's the only living daughter of Chaves Nogales, and who's going to be 99 this year. I spoke with her just before we came in. And she was very annoyed, and she said she wanted to be here. But I think one of the important things is, Chaves Nogales is from very early on an internationalist in his outlook. He's looking outside. He's looking at what's going on internationally. His work is innovative. People talk about it being new journalism. But in a way, people often talk about new journalism being associated with Truman Capote and the likes. And Chaves Nogales is way ahead of this time in terms of his perspective and his ability to write about things. And obviously, I see it through tinted glasses as a member of the family. But his ability to write about things in a way that enables the reader to feel that they're there. The ability to feel that you're there. And, if you read his work, and as we came rushing up the stairs, we saw there's a great collection of his books available here in the foyer. As we came up the stairs, we were stopping and just thinking, in 1928, just 1 year after Ruth Elder crosses the Atlantic in a plane, he writes a book called La Vuelta de Europa en Avión, and he goes across Europe by plane. He crashes, I think, 3 times. He crashes with 3 times. He complains before he sets off that he's given 500 pesetas for the whole journey to fund it. And he literally goes right the way across Europe and writes very much in Chaves Nogales style about what he sees. Every stop, you know, we're in Marseille. What are people like here? How do they do? The observation capability. And I guess this talent of his to observe and transmit to those of us reading it today, without the benefit of his presence, is really important, because it enables us to live those moments, to see those perspectives and the likes. And I think, you know, part of my role here tonight is to give some family perspective. I think Ignacio asked me to do that, and I use some. And I'm just going to use an anecdotal story, which I think is very, very descriptive of what type of a person Chaves Nogales was. Both of you talked to, you'd had, as we did, the opportunity to talk with his grandmother, his family, his sons, his daughters. And it's when he's here in London and he writes to the family who are essentially in hiding in El Ronquillo, just outside Sevilla. And at that time, Paul's father, Peyro, is, excuse me saying this, a bit of a hooligan, as most people are at that age. And he's, you know, throwing stones and doing all the things that young boys should do. And Chaves Nogales writes to the family, and he asks about Pablo, and he asks about each member of the family and how they're doing, whilst he's here in Exile, to try and understand. And he uses this lovely expression, which I'll say in Spanish and then switch. And he goes, y Pablo. And Pablo is probably 9 at this age. Y Pablo, reflexiona. Reflexiona. Does Pablo reflect on important things? And, you know, the response to the family is, no, Pablo está tirando piedras. Pablo's throwing stones and kicking things around, as he should be at that age. But I think this says a lot about Chaves Nogales and his style of writing, which is to observe things, important things that are happening here, things that are happening on the wider European stage, and reflect on them. We've just come from Europe House, where the opening of a 2-week exhibition is happening on his works. We've just come running through the traffic from Europe House. And there was the ability to reflect as we came from Europe House, that Chaves Nogales would have been going, what's all this fuss about my work and things? Because he was never somebody to be at the front of the stage. He was always observing and noting and helping other people. But I think, you know, the most important thing, and as a family we're delighted with the exhibition, with these talks, with all the work that's being done between Instituto Cervantes, the British Library, the Embassy, a lot of people at the University of Seville collaborating together. And the one thing I would say as a family is, for us, what's really important is his work. I'd encourage you all, if you have the opportunity, to read his work. He talks about really interesting things. And if he was here, he'd say, y reflexiona. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure if I have time for all of it, but the prologue to the book, what was it called in English? Eva? In the Distance?
Alive. It has 2 titles.
And there's Heroes and Beasts, Beasts and Martyrs of Spain.
Yes.
That's the American version.
Yes, the American.
But in Spanish it was published in 1937 as A Sangre y Fuego, which Ignacio may be able to tell me. Something is like, if something is done a sangre y fuego, it's done in a very brutal manner. So it's kind of a synonym of brutally, but obviously that doesn't capture any of that, by blood and by fire. I kind of winced at translating that. But this is the prologue to the book, which is a collection of kind of fictionalized chronicles. They're basically short stories based on the things that he himself saw in the war. And this is his kind of very kind of angry and he's kind of thinking back on his anger from a place of more peace in Paris, thinking of explaining why he left Spain. And just a quick translator's note, there are a few kind of references in here that sound a bit odd or aren't immediately obvious, and I chose to keep them as they are. One of the reasons we couldn't read out the original translation, which was In the Distance of Light, was because there were some references that were very much not okay now, in the way that the translator, there were some words that we definitely couldn't say in the British Library. So, anyway, without further ado, I'll start. So this is the prologue to A Sangre y Fuego, or In the Distance of Light, or Beasts and Martyrs of Spain. I used to be what sociologists call a petit bourgeois liberal, a citizen of a democratic parliamentary republic. I was an intellectual worker serving an industry run by a capitalist bourgeoisie that was close to the landholding aristocracy, which in my country had traditionally monopolised both the means of production and of exchange, as the Marxists would have it. I earned my daily bread and my freedom in relative comfort, concocting newspapers and writing articles, reportage, biographies, stories and novels. And this led me to believe I was somehow nourishing the spirits of my compatriots and sustaining their interests in and engagement with the great issues of our time. When I came back from Moscow and wrote that Russian workers live terrible lives and prop up a dictatorship which they have deluded themselves into thinking they control, my boss congratulated me with an affectionate pat on the back. When I returned from Rome and made it clear to the public that fascism had neither added a single ounce to the bread ration of the average Italian, nor in any way replenished the country's traditional moral values, my boss seemed significantly less pleased with me and doubted my skills as a journalist. But ultimately, through good days and bad, through periods of praise and of censure, I was still able to pursue my own truth in my capacity as a liberal intellectual, as a citizen of a democratic parliamentary republic. When capitalism would not so readily lend me its great printing presses and reams of paper, so that I might say publicly what I wished to say, I resigned myself to saying it in the cafe, at the news desk, or from the humble pulpit of a provincial council meeting, without fear of being gagged, thrown into jail by the police, or made to pay a terrible price for my mistakes by a band of shirted thugs. Both anti-fascist and anti-revolutionary in temperament, I systematically refused to believe in the healthful benefits of big crowds, and I waited and I kept on working, maintaining my faith in the inevitable course of the laws of evolution. With all due respect, I've always felt revolutionaries to be just as pernicious a species as their reactionary counterparts. To speak honestly and bluntly, the bare minimum I sought to get across in my profession, as well as in the true and fictional stories I've written, my truth, my single humble truth, was simply an unsurmountable hatred of stupidity and cruelty. To put it another way, it was a natural aversion to the only sin I believed to be real, the sin against intelligence, the sin against the Holy Spirit. And yet stupidity and cruelty were now taking hold of Spain. Where did this infection start? The petri dishes of this new plague were germinated in that grey Asian rubbish tip and then served up to us by the laboratories of Moscow, Rome and Berlin, disguised as communism, fascism and National Socialism. And this is one of the words which I just left as it is, even though it sounds a bit odd. And the Celtiberian man gobbled them all up unwittingly. After 3 centuries lying fallow, the fertile soil of Spain propagated the seeds of ancestral stupidity and cruelty with terrifying efficiency. Any attempt to identify the source of this outbreak of fratricidal fever, did it begin in this or that sector of society, in this area of Spanish life or the other, will be in vain. Neither reds nor whites need shoulder the blame. Idiots and murderers have appeared in equal numbers and acted with similar excess and intensity on both of the sides into which Spain has been split. From my own limited experience, I can affirm that someone as insignificant as myself was considered worthy of being shot by people on both sides. I have it on good authority that even before the Civil War broke out, a fascist group in Madrid had made the perfectly routine decision to proceed with my assassination as a preventative measure that had to be taken in the face of the possible triumph of the social revolution. This was notwithstanding the fact that the revolutionaries, anarchists and communists also considered me to be eminently shootable. When the war broke out, I remained in my post and continued to carry out my professional duties. A workers' council made up of delegates from the factories dismissed the proprietor of the newspaper company I was working for and took over all of his functions. I, who had never in my life been a revolutionary and who had no sympathy whatsoever for the dictatorship of the proletariat, found myself in the midst of a full-blown Soviet regime. So I put myself at the service of the workers, just as previously I had been at the service of the capitalists. In other words, I was both loyal to them and to myself. I made my lack of revolutionary conviction and my opposition to all dictatorships, including the dictatorship of the proletariat, well known, and I dedicated myself solely to defending the cause of the people against fascism and the military uprising. I became comrade editor, and I can attest to the fact that during the months of the war which I spent in Madrid, at the head of a government paper that managed to achieve the biggest print run of the whole Republican press, nobody ever bothered me for my lack of revolutionary spirit or for being a petit bourgeois liberal, a status which I never renounced. During this period, I saw many reactionaries transform into fervent communists and many well-off bourgeois become fearsome anarchists. War and fear justified everything. Shoulder to shoulder with the revolutionaries, I, who was not a revolutionary, fought against fascism using the weapon of my profession. My conscience is not troubled with accusations of apostasy, for whenever I disagreed with them, they left me in peace. I left when I became utterly convinced that all was lost and there was nothing left to save, when the daily terror and the spilt blood made life unbearable. But hold on a minute. The Red Terror carried out by death squads on the streets of Madrid influenced my desertion just as much as the terror pouring down from Franco's planes as they slaughtered innocent women and children. And I was just as afraid, or perhaps even more so, of the barbarity of the Moors, the banditry of the foreign legions, and the Falangist murderers, as I was of the illiterate anarchists and communists. The hard heads will surely say, in Spanish that's something like espiritus fuerte. We thought that didn't quite work in English. Will surely say that this aversion to human butchery is mere anachronistic sentimentality. That is quite possible, but without making a big song and dance about it, without ascribing more value to human life than it can or should have in our time, without giving the act of killing more meaning that prevailing moral standards already give it, I have nevertheless chosen to allow myself the luxury of not having any solidarity with murderers. For a Spaniard, such a luxury may well be excessive. Of course, one pays dearly for taking such an attitude. The current price is the nation itself. But to tell the truth, when faced with the choice of becoming either a pale-skinned Abyssinian, and this is another one of those references that is probably slightly lost in time, which a pale-skinned Abyssinian, which is what one is condemned to be under Franco, or an Occidental Kyrgyz, as the agents of Bolshevism would have you be, I preferred to simply put my hands in my pockets and set off around the world, at least that is, around the parts of the world that are still inhabitable, knowing full well that in this era of narrow, arrogant nationalisms, the exile, the stateless subject, is everywhere an undesirable guest who must atone for his very existence through humility and through servitude. But I can more easily bear servitude on foreign soil than in my own home. When the government of the Republic abandoned its post and fled to Valencia, I also abandoned mine, not a moment sooner and not a moment later. For my status as a citizen of the Spanish Republic demanded nothing less and nothing more from me. The power abandoned in the trenches of Madrid by the legitimate government was picked up by the men who stayed on, heroically defending the territory. Should they win, the future of Spain belongs to them. Should they lose, it will belong to their vanquishers. The outcome of this struggle doesn't worry me a great deal. I'm not at all that concerned as to whether the future dictator of Spain comes from one side of the trenches or the other. It's all the same to me. The strong man, the general, the triumphant winner, the one who will eventually have to sit down in the pool of blood that was my country and keep it in servitude with a knife between his teeth, could come from either side. It makes no difference. Whoever he is, he will certainly not be found amongst any of the leaders or generals who in their monstrous cruelty and stupidity have provoked this great Spanish cataclysm. Every last one of them is already drowning in the blood that has been spilled. Nor will he come from among our number, those of us who have stepped away from the battle in fear and in disgust. Far less likely is the possibility that the tide will somehow turn and enable the resurrection of any of the monarchist or republican personalities whom the war has killed in such a civil manner. The man who will embody what survives of Spain will come from a cruel and ignorant selection that has already got the better of the best and most noble spirits. Will he come from the right, the left? Will he be red, white? It's immaterial. No matter who he is, in order to make his mark, in order to survive, he will first of all have to renege on whatever ideal it is that right now has him standing on the parapet, his rifle held aloft, ready to die and to kill. Whoever he is, he'll be a traitor to whatever cause he is defending today. Whether he comes from one camp or the other, from one side of the trenches or the other, sooner or later he will arrive at the only conceivable formula by which he can survive, creating a state which allows citizens with opposing ideas to live in peace with one another, and which permits normal relations with other states. In other words, the exact thing that those fighting today in their limitless stupidity and cruelty will not allow. There will only be one difference, one small nuance, and that is whether the new Spanish state can count on one group of European powers and be prudently tolerated by another, or vice versa. Nothing more. Neither fascist colony nor communist outpost. Neither a tyranny of the aristocracy or a dictatorship of the proletariat. Within, it will be a dictatorial government which, rifle in hand, will force the Spanish, which will force the Spanish people to work desperately and endure hunger for 20 years without complaint, until we paid for the war. Red or white, army captain or political commissar, fascist or communist, probably neither, or perhaps both at once, the galley master who with his whip will force us to row and row until we're out of this storm, will be cruel and inhumane, no matter who they are. On the outside, there will be a strong state, protected by some nations and viewed with suspicion by others. But whether it's this lot or that bunch, this tiny thing which will eventually be decided around the table and depend mostly on the intelligence of those doing the negotiating, will have cost Spain more than 500,000 dead. The price could have been so much lower. When I reached this conclusion, I gave up my role in the fight. A man of a single trade, I wandered around loyalist Spain together with a horde of people whom the winds of war had uprooted from their homes and from their trades. I expatriated myself when I became convinced there was no longer anything to be done in Spain that would not simply further contribute to the war. Naturally, I landed in the suburb of Paris, the destination of so much of that human residue left in the wake of the monstrous construction of the totalitarian states. Here in this modest hotel in a Paris suburb, a diverse range of specimens from old Europe live in squalor, waiting to die. Russian priests, German Jews, Italian revolutionaries, every one of them mournful and aggrieved, struggling to achieve the unattainable, a new citizenship, a country of their choosing. I don't want to join this sorry legion of the uprooted, and though I now take the fact of being Spanish as a personal affront, I'm still trying to retain a Spanish citizenship of a purely spiritual nature, one which no white or red can take from me. In order to free myself from the anguish of expatriation and also of exile, and also to make a living, I've begun to write again, and I've gradually started taking pleasure in my new occupation as a storyteller. From this corner of Paris, Spain and the war, so close, so current, so alive, have the air of pure memory about them, and narrate the things I've witnessed and experienced more faithfully than I would like to. Some of the characters, by dint of being alive, being living, breathing beings, rise up against me and tear off the literary marks I've attempted to make them wear. They slip between my fingers, and they say and do things that I, out of shame, didn't want them to do or to say. Grappling with them and with myself to keep my distance, to remain apart, to stay impartial, I offer you these tales of the war and revolution. And though I presumptuously sought to place them, and forgive me for my Latin pronunciation, sub specie aeternitatis, I don't presume to have been successful. And maybe it's better that way. And that's it for
Thank you very much, Rahul, for your brilliant rendition, for your brilliant translation of these pages that one cannot read or one cannot listen to without feeling moved. And it is being indeed a very moving evening. As Tony Jones just said, we were at the opening of an exhibition on Manuel Chaves Nogales, and after that we've had the chance, although we were a bit late, to listen to Eva Nieto and to Tony himself again. So all in all, for those of us who have an interest in Spanish exile, who have an interest in the links between the UK, between London and Spain, it is still being a very special evening. I will be as brief as I can, but before I start, I want to thank them all for the brilliant speeches and translations. Of course, it is a privilege to give a small talk here at the British Library, and I can only say big thanks to our hosts, to Barry, Fedes, and Gio, and all our friends, not only as a speaker, of course, but also as director of Instituto Cervantes, London. I'm delighted that every year we find several events where we can collaborate, and no doubt this is a particularly nice one. Well, even though we are Cervantes, also the Spanish Embassy are devoting several days to commemorate Chaves Nogales and the Spanish exile, as we did last year with Arturo Galean. I'm glad to see Uli Rushby-Smith among us here today, which is a very, very nice surprise. I'm very glad to say hello, Uli. I wanted to delve into another author that maybe is not too familiar for many in Britain, namely Josep Pla, a Catalan writer that both in Catalan and in Spanish is widely considered, with Chaves Nogales, among the best journalists in 20th century Spain. A man who did not endure exile in London, but nevertheless did devote significant pages to Britain, and we thought it was interesting to delve into his life and into his rapport with Britain. So if you don't mind, and considering we don't have the whole evening already, I'll go straight to the point of Pla's Anglophilia. In the early 1920s, the young Josep Pla, then a correspondent in Paris, would develop a strange obsession with bowler hats. The painter Enrique Ricard explained in his memoir that with a bowler hat in his possession, Pla wanted to amuse himself by running it through his fingers playfully during conversations. Undoubtedly, no one is immune to these sartorial whims of youth. Even so, it is remarkable that, among all possible adornments, Pla should choose the bowler hat, which from the 19th century onwards was to become an eloquent icon of Anglophile devotion worldwide. And it is indeed remarkable because Josep Pla never shared that feeling which García Pelayo described as that continental soccer's delight about Great Britain. In fact, we never think of him as one of the cast from Ramiro de Maeztu to Augusto Asia or Salvador de Maria, which has been quoted here before, of Anglophile Spaniards. And after all, there seems to be no shortage of reasons to exclude him from that cast. Pla dedicated whole books to France, including some historical ones. Italy, for him, not only deserved hundreds of pages, but he wanted to identify himself fully with it. Italy, he writes, is my country. If I can, I will spend half of my life in Italy. In Germany, the experience of overwhelming inflation between the wars would leave its moral scar on him for many years. And from the birth of the State of Israel, or the Second Republic in Spain, none of Pla's British itineraries would offer an experience of comparable depth. It is legitimate, however, in my view, to talk of a Planian or Planian Anglophilia, discreet for being less focused, but still functioning and real, and vivid enough for him to speak of the, for instance, of the soft light of the pulse, the British legacy in Minorca, the Nicholson diaries, or the high politics of Gladstone. Our author also occasionally opens the door for us to a powerfully personal Anglophile archaeology, like when he remembers the thoughts prompted by the names of English newspapers when he was a boy, or when he confesses that his best guide to London was none other than the memory of reading Charles Dickens. And it is not surprising. Pla was born into a world that still, in the words of Luigi Barzini, which is more or less an Italo-American copy of Pla, fiercely believed that British was best. And throughout Pla's work, that stamp of Anglophile passion pops up here and there when he praises the Anglo-Andalusian stateliness of the wife of the poet Joan Maragall, when he describes the passion for all things British of writer and diplomat Joseph Carner in Genoa, when he himself submits to a great admiration for Queen Victoria, or praises the bourgeois attitudes of that English 19th century, the best that have existed in this continent. Now, this was a Britishness not of birth, but of prestige as lived by the European elite. Ian Bruma illustrates this in a brilliant book, Between the Time of Voltaire and that of Churchill. There is then an important foundation that precedes Pla's first encounter with Great Britain when he first travels here. And the Catalan author himself admits to genuine sentimental affection for the country before even landing here. From that first foundation onwards, the unfolding of Pla's Anglophilia stretches across nearly 6 decades, from his Chestertonian pieces when he started at La Publicidad, to the mentions of Boswell and Johnson in his late Notes del Campesprol. We're not talking about hundreds of pages. Pla himself regrets that his memoirs on England are short, but they do add up to a significant corpus of Anglophilia that is as bookish as it is lived and as read as it is traveled. We could even say, in the limited context, according to Valentí Puig, of Pla's narrative, that Great Britain merited the rare privilege of inspiring quite a few of the stories collected in La Vida Amarga, recently translated by Peter Bush as Life Embitters, and including the unusually unrealistic Oscura Santidad Nórdica, dark northern sainthood, roughly translated. I don't know, Rahul as approximator. But in any case, it is legitimate to talk about unpleasant Anglophilia, which reconciles the knowledge of a literature with the observation of a country. And that Anglophilia is not so surprising. After all, he tells us, England had helped him to destroy all the seeds of gratuitous haughtiness I carried inside me as a Latin. And that was something for which the writer will always feel, and I'm quoting, magnanimously grateful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, since we don't have the time to delve into Pla's devotion to English literature, maybe another day if I get an invitation from our hosts, we will focus on the extent to which his views on the British way of life and character coincide with those of the continental Anglophile tradition. I have asked myself many times, he writes in his profile of Winston Churchill, if it will ever be possible to understand the English. Of course, the writer knows that many have asked themselves the same question from Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher who was capable of judging the English people as the strangest thing on the planet. I'm sorry, I'm just quoting. To Casanova, the famous Italian bon vivant, who claimed the way of life is unlike that of any other people. And indeed, that British peculiarity could not have been a better testing ground for Pla's skill as an observer. As I said, it's evident how much Pla's notes on the world of the English correspond to those of the continent's Anglophile tradition and how they lend it continuity. From his own writing, we know that Pla was well read in at least the classics of the genre, like Hippolyte Taine's Notes on England, and Moretin the Younger's Apuntaciones Sueltas de Inglaterra, loose notes on England, and without any doubt he was familiar too with Voltaire's English Letters, which he described as one of the books which is read with the most fluency. Still only in his 20s, Pla arrived in London with a certain disposition for collecting cities. His first experience of the capital reminds us of the Dr. Johnson, who said that to be tired of London was to be tired of life. In Pla's words, London has an atmosphere that rejuvenates and eases all the muscles. It makes you feel young again. He was in his 20s. He even marvels at feeling rejuvenated on arrival in a country that is so old. Without leaving the capital, leaning like Heinrich Heine on the balustrade of the Thames, Pla sees the longest highway in the world, in that trading river which Verlaine had seen as the son of Tyre and Carthage. From here, Pla and the essayists, native and foreign in England, lend themselves to comparison in all the talk about London Sundays, the British love of animals, or their frequent condemnation of local cuisine. And it is enlightening to find parallels between Pla's prose and that of some of the writings of his predecessors as an endorsement of the quality of his observations on the Isles. For example, where Moratín, Blanco White, and Julio Camba hated the aforementioned English Sunday, a tedious and endless day for Pere de Ayala, Pla noted that in one of his commentaries it was the delirium of silence of those same Sundays in the north of England, which in London had struck him as tedious and lacking in humanity as the grave. When the Catalan writer tells us of his futile attempts to describe the built environment of London, he confirms that he always returns with his hands empty. Without finding, he writes, anything to indicate an intention to create an urban aesthetic that reflects the impressive political edifice of the empire. We could add a footnote here on Paul Morand, the famous diplomat, traveler, and French writer, who saw the anti-Paris in the improvised accumulation of London. Or we can also quote Lord Kenneth, who pointed out the success of the English countryside as against the failure, he writes, of its cities. In fact, Pla always considers British architecture as toned down with a lack of inflated grandiloquence, at just the head of the human being. Chiming with the many commentators who have talked about the British rejection, we might think recently of Harry Mount, of the Grand Projet, big projects so typical of France, for instance. If the appreciation of landscape, for instance, in his native Catalonia wasn't constant in Pla's writing, the attachment the English have for their land could not go unnoticed for him. English landscape is much more composed and artificial than it seems, although geometry is excluded from that composition, he wrote, chiming with Voltaire, who had already attributed to the British the love of irregular beauty. The English countrysides illustrates thus the nostalgic maintenance of the idyllic spirit. In the same way, writes Pla, as Washington Evening had praised the moral sentiments which seem to be permeated, order, tranquility, restrained and well-established principles, traditional uses, and reverent customs. Perhaps for these reasons, the countryside, with its poetic value, according to Pla, makes you understand the literature of the country. And this is no small observation, given that from the Lake District of Wordsworth to Walton's celebration of fishing and the Hampshire of Jane Austen, British literature enjoys a particular coherence with nature as its backdrop. As far as the human character is concerned, Pla, contemplating the miners of the famous strikes in the 1920s, can only admire the extent of the courage, seriousness, dignity and virtue, I'm quoting, that appeared in the countenances of these uncomplicated people. It is more or less the same admiration George Orwell expressed for the masses who, until way after the post-war period, filled the football terraces as peacefully as those, Orwell wrote, attending Sunday Mass. In the same way, Pla knew how to distinguish the cold type of Englishman, conventional and ceremonious, so usual in continental novels, from all the, he writes, typically English buffoonery, which originates in the cliché of Merry England. This cheerful basis is compatible with the notorious British love of privacy, and Pla observes that the Englishman is a real, authentic recluse, just as Ibn Wahb pointed out the agoraphobic character of the inhabitants of these isles, from their medieval moats to their suburban hedges. Other aspect, for instance, if, as Rahul, a Spanish writer, observed, alcohol has the same importance in English public life as the sun does for the Spanish. It was way back then. Pla offers us the portrait of a certain Mr. Morton, typical Englishman, he says, who in one of his British stories drank a dozen of bottles of scotch every week. As Moratin had already noted in the 18th century, finding men of distinction drunk on wine was not considered a great defect in England. Regarding another cliché of the country, which I of course regret to mention, namely the reputation for sadism and perversion which dogs the English, which is a major point of agreement in German Anglophobia, for instance, the Great War, Pla points out how massively complicated their crimes are, perhaps because, as Agatha Christie suggested, with a crime everyone has something to hide. When specifically faced with these clichés of Anglophobia, Pla reacted very strongly in a paragraph which is in itself a powerful defense of Britishness. According to our author, at parties in my unforgettable country, I've heard many times that England is a mercantile, egotistical and frosty nation. As for actual English people, they are slow, unflappable, rarely capricious, not particularly genial. They are labeled mediocre and largely insensitive. If one listens to what is being said aloud about them, one could conclude that England has nothing to offer, no literature, philosophy, science, art, wit, nor ingenuity. For Pla, however, when it comes to the moment of truth, the only thing that doesn't disappoint, what is always maintained, what provides a plausible and tolerable way of life, is the English spirit. Well, you have an English nationalist in here, in a way. Well, perhaps aware of the common ground between his observations and those of some of his predecessors, Pla explains that when he observes British life, he is not inclined to pile on the cliches. His real aim is to offer us an element which, like a continuous bass note, sustains his particular style. The desire to capture those everyday things which make up the lyrical background of life. The fact that so many of his Anglo pieces have similarities with what classic writers of the genre have said gives that same classical weight to Pla's own Anglophilia. And well, I'm getting to the end, more or less, of my talk here, but we still have 5 minutes, I think, to talk about how the elderly Pla faced the British reality. As a minimum plan for politics, he had written in the 20s, young Pla had asked for a bit of English Revolution, a bit of French Revolution, and a bit of Russian Revolution. Whether or not this was just a flippant remark, around 1964, more than 4 decades after he had written that, the Major Pla had adopted a very different kind of political seriousness. This shows, for example, in the already quoted biographical sketch of Churchill, which, with a great man already close to death, he was going to write for Destino, a very important magazine during Franco years. It is a piece in which his praise for Churchill is also between the lines of praise for Britain. We see it when he defines the grand politician as one of the greatest men of the freedom movement, when he asserts that he was able to align his life with the institutions of the country which are based on freedom, tolerance, and responsibility. Or when he writes that he had defended a human coexistence based on rights and law. Pla's combination of depth and brilliance when he writes on British politics can make us regret, as readers, how few pages he produced on the subject. It is in Drunk Exile Somenot, biography of his thinker, where those brief ideas are taken further with a greater moral and emotional significance. Pla argues posthumously with Claychelles, who writes a letter to poet Carlos Riba, who was just being quoted by Eva Nieto, about the English and England. The humanist sage compares Germany with England favorably for the latter, and Pla, rather than allowing himself to be distracted, embarks on an exceptional strategy to draw the reader into the English cause, to take him to the London he remembered, to ponder the Houses of Parliament, the Foreign Office, and the Admiralty. Contemplative beside the buildings that govern the empire, Pla declares the indefinable appearance of tenacity and solidity they give off. Always, and it is one, he says, it is one of the most significant things about this town, without anything to impress one out of proportion. However, Pla testifies to the difficulty of separating the effect they produce as urban structures from how they represent other perspectives of the human spirit. So from St. James's Park, looking at the departments that govern the politics of foreign affairs and the armed forces in Britain, the Spanish author is conscious of being in the presence of two important pillars of the world, pillars that one can hate, that one can detest, but which undeniably produce a feeling of respect, and which make the spectator think about the whole of life and history from a perspective of imposing universality. A few paragraphs earlier in Westminster, Pla had asked himself who could, beside the Houses of Parliament, not think of the historical and political significance of these stones. Beside that building, who could not ponder on the wave of optimism and liberty that has passed that way, on what was born in that place, rights of the human being, the habeas corpus, and has spread the world over, on what the English Parliament represents for anyone who was not born with blue blood. Yes, he writes, contemplating the Houses of Parliament gives you a rapturous feeling of pride, simply to be a man, and a joy in admiring a people who have done what they can and without a material incentive to allow the whole world to savor the taste of freedom. With the finesse of an historian, but in the present he was experiencing, this Major Pla was also an apologist for the period after the Second World War, as compared to the period between the world wars. And his long news piece about John Maynard Keynes, one of the people who most influenced the modeling of the 20th century, shows us Pla's enthusiasm for the so-called post-war consensus. That is worth mentioning because this is not the usual Pla, although characteristically he justifies through conservatism his defense of economic intervention. When looking to salvage as far as possible an economic freedom that is reduced and dying, he writes, there is only one way, to apply the lesser of two evils, trim it a little to save what can be saved, which is a typical plane and wave approaching life in general. All these feelings of optimism resurface in the pages Pla writes during his final stay in London in June 1969, collected in El Viaje se acaba, The Journey Comes to an End. Here, Pla's enthusiasm is at a premium. Even the air, he says, in London has a sharp liveliness of touch. London has ceased to be the city of fog, replaced by a city of light and much more benign facades. The city, demolished by the Nazis and newly rebuilt, is almost unrecognizable. It is a much more airy world of wider streets with some very modern grand buildings. On what was to be his farewell to England, we should ponder with sadness on Pla's support for the tenacity of the government back then regarding England's entry into the common market, in spite of the campaign running against this entry. And it is only human to rejoice in the fact that Pla could say goodbye to the Isles when they were living their last glory days for a long time. At the start of the 1970s, the now exhausted post-war politics would give way to a long decade of economic decline and social discontent. The old values admired by Pla would become the object of devotion for the nostalgic, among other reasons, as a result of the reformist measures undertaken by Prime Minister Wilson, whom he had admired a lot. And as for those very modern grand buildings erected hurriedly after the war, rather than maturing, some of them have merely deteriorated. Those are pages that, sadly for us and luckily for him, Pla did not have the time to write. But in any case, I think he would have always maintained an image of an Anglophilia capable of overcoming the eventualities of the age. Or he writes beautifully of those waters that flow by the venerable stones of Parliament, like the waters of time, he writes, at the feet of the towers of human toil and hope. Thank you.